Pat, it's 2023, and we are going to be talking about anniversary movies. On There's Nostalgia Like Nostalgia this year. There's a lot of big ones coming up for very popular movies and some obscure movies, but they all have something in common, which is they are turning a number years old.
Right.
And we're kicking things
Ending with
off.
three.
Yes, well, not the anniversary number, but the year it came out, three or I think
Yeah.
eight in some cases. The
Oh,
fives or the
yeah,
tens.
sure. If you're
Yeah,
gonna,
but
very good.
but this year or this month we are talking about Cabin in the Sky, which came out in 1943. And it's weird because there's a birthday associated with this. The director Vincent Minnelli, who is Liza Minnelli's dad, his birthday was February 28th,
How about
1903.
that?
So we are
Wow.
120 years just shy of a day of his
Wow.
that birthday.
Crazy.
And
Crazy.
he was born in Chicago. I didn't know that until I was
Yep.
looking up some stuff on the film. Now, this is based on a 1940 Broadway show with an all black
Right.
cast. It was turned
Right.
into a film with an all black cast. And it is it's a redemption tale. It's very clearly a morality tale, as is spelled out in the title cards. A lot of kind of religious Christian themes. But it's a film that I'd watched probably 15 years ago or so, and I'd forgotten a lot about
Okay.
it. So the chance to revisit it and talk about it with you was quite a thrill. Had you seen this
Yeah.
before?
Same fear. I never seen it before. So, and I'm a fairly um, high student of the studio era. So this was exciting for me because it's definitely in the midst of the highest end of the studio era, and it was made during World War II.
And there's a great, very subtle, I think, clever World War II reference. There
Right.
are angels and demons in this movie, and at one point, the head demon, who is Lucifer Jr., is complaining because he's the head of the ideas department in hell, and all of
Right.
his minions are having trouble coming up with good ideas. And he says, "I apparently got the B team. The A team is working things out over in Europe."
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
And that was a big transition point for blacks in America because they were called to serve in the war, but the army was still segregated, and they were also given some subservient roles, the exceptions being the Tuskegee Airmen and such. But this was the first period in sort of the post Civil War era where blacks were actually participating in the patriotism of America after not being allowed at the table for so long. So, interesting perspective on everything in the sense of where this film comes from. So,
yeah, it's also, I haven't watched a whole lot of, I guess, black centric films from this era. One thing that
mm-hmm.
struck out immediately, A, is that it was literally an all black cast, and B,
Right.
it seems to be self-contained in terms of its culture and politics. It's almost as if it's a world in which white people don't exist. I mean, they don't talk about systemic oppression. Not that they necessarily thought in or had those terms for it back then, but
Mm-hmm.
it's people going about their lives and dealing with the problems that are sort of universal to all people, which it's kind of unfortunate that, as with the times, this film was protested in some theaters. It was shut down
Yeah.
because, you can't have an all an all black movie. That's crazy. That's wrong. But
I
it is
just
one of those
can't
things that,
believe that I
okay.
can't believe that they used the police to actually raid a theater after the film had been going on for 30 minutes because it was such an offense to delicate sensibilities.
Yeah. And
Crazy to me.
it just, I guess it speaks to the times, because watching this in, 2023, and
Yeah.
perhaps this is the effect of, having 80 years of this film being around, and then the civil rights movement and the enactment of federal civil rights 20 years after this movie came out. I'm watching it as not as a black picture as you might think of it, just as I'm relating to these characters and these sort of midlife existential, spiritual crises that they're going through. Not that I have a dice problem or anything like that.
That's interesting you bring that up. I was very interested in the church angle because, again, historically, African Americans rose up through the church, and the one thing that blacks and whites, even though they were mostly segregated during that time, had in common was religion. And of course, Dr. Martin Luther King came out of the church, and many of the civil rights leaders that were to come came out of the church. So the use of the church in this piece, and I'm sure it's the same as the stage play, was very much a character that permeates the whole story. You have the good of the church and the bad of the nightclub, and never the twain shall meet, as we find out.
I mean, it's interesting because a lot of that, you're right, and a lot of the great speeches and ideas that came out of the civil rights movement, a lot of that language is based, in kind of theological principles. I don't know if it was a conscious strategy, but it, I think, did help to, in some ways, at least plant the seeds to bridge those gaps of, like, we're talking in the same language that you're using when you go to church every Sunday. What makes us so different?
Well, how can you purport to be a Christian if you reject certain elements of love thy fellow man? You become a hypocrite. And I think it was a natural way of infiltrating in the early civil rights movement that grew, of course, because it was so successful.
Yeah, and so the movie at hand, it's about a couple, the Jacksons. You got Petunia, played by Ethel Waters, and Little Joe, played by Eddie Rochester Anderson. She is very much a spiritual woman, a woman of the church, prays constantly for her husband, who has a severe gambling problem. What do they call them? His calamity cubes, the dice that he rolls, and he's buying lottery tickets. When he first
referenced that, I was like, I thought it was some sort of like talisman. I didn't realize there were dice until finally it occurred to me.
I picked up on it right away, probably in fairness, because I'd seen it before, but I was like, they should just call dice calamity cubes. That's a great, a great name for it.
Amazing.
But so Little Joe has
descriptive element,
right? But he's got this problem. He has, at the beginning of the picture, he has ostensibly turned his life around, and he's going to church with Petunia to essentially be reborn. But there's a knock at the window, and a bunch of his gambling buddies come to drag him out in secret and say, hey, there's something going down at the gambling hall. And there was it
that character comes about later? What was the name of his character?
Was it Domino Johnson?
Domino, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Domino.
Perfect name for a gambling hustler, right? So sure. Domino Johnson's in town. He's got a lot of money to throw around. And there's a prospect for if Little Joe is going to retire anyway and find God, he might as well do it with one last big bankroll. So they convince him to go down to this gambling hall. He gets shot and just about mortally wounded during this game. And so begins a battle for his soul, like a literal one. Like I mentioned, there's angels and demons vying for possession of his immortal spirit. And the deal that they strike is they're going to send him back to Earth for 6 months. He's going to have no memory of this conversation, but he has 6 months to turn his life around and come to God, essentially, and reject gambling and all the wicked ways of the world. And it's like a half hour into this hour and a half plus movie, but the plot really kicks into place after that.
Well, one of the things that I didn't delve much into the stage play of Cabin in the Sky, but one of the things that struck me about just the story was the presumption that Black men are the ones that need to be saved, and they need to be saved by their good women, good Christian women. And And with, of course, the preachers being the ones that are the bridge. They're the proof that there are good black men out there, that they're not just shiftless gamblers and people who naturally have affairs with Lena Horne. So I was like, it was so interesting to me that, the presumption was that, the black man is the one that needs to be saved to save the overall atmosphere and civilization of the world that is created in the movie.
Well, I mean, I do take your point, but I mean, if we were to extrapolate that and look at some other depictions of like, in movies, it is typically the men who have to be saved, kind of regardless of race. There's always some kind of a problem, not necessarily like degenerate gambling or something, but usually it's the mom who's like the homemaker. She's holding down the family. She's, trying to keep it together, everyone, because the dad is an alcoholic or a womanizer or a gambler. I was talking to Jeff York about Hollywood Shuffle, which is another conversation that's going to be coming out, and how the supporting characters, the female supporting characters in that movie, were not drawn particularly imaginatively, or certainly not in the way that we would look at them today. And I think that's the case in Cabin in the Sky, but I think it's partially because there was the civil rights movement that was, very, to my understanding, and I think depictions of popular media, very men-centric. And it wasn't until later that they kind of got a more holistic view of everybody as sort of people deserving of their own kind of plot lines.
Well, to me, it just played into the stereotype of black men that I think was perpetuated at the time. Overstimulated, oversexed. They have to be reined in by the aspect of the church. I just punched up Lynn Wood's name, who wrote the libretto, and Lynn, Lynn. I assume he's a dude, because I don't know. It didn't have much background on him, but it was just interesting to me.
Yeah, and I know there's been some criticisms of this movie, as you're going to find with a lot of, entertainment that was targeted at, the black community back then, of, leaning into stereotypes, especially because you've got, a white director. It's sort of this outsider directing the insiders, in terms of like, this is how you should portray. Again, going kind of back to the Hollywood Shuffle, can you play it more black? And this is how we think that you should portray this on screen, and this is how you should be. And then you had these actors who, many of them were just, I think, excited to work on like a kind of a studio picture. They're like, yeah, this is the work we can get. Things are going to get better from here, but they won't unless we start something.
Well, some of the background notes made a big deal about how producer Arthur Freed, one of the most famous of the MGM musical era, and Vincent Minnelli sought out the NAACP at the time and preachers and everything to go over the script and make sure that they weren't, pushing on the gas pedal too much when it came to stereotypes. I find, after watching it, that it's more about the entertainment rather than any kind of, stereotypical characteristics. But again, I'm looking at historically and as an outsider and all that stuff. So it's a fascinating film altogether.
Oh yeah, I think Cabin in the Sky is great, but there are pockets, and it's hard to say how much of this was stereotyped due to insensitivity versus just, comedic effect. For example, I mentioned Lucifer Jr. and his minions. There's the one guy who is, half asleep, and he has to be kind of roused out. And he's kind of got that, yes, massa, that kind of like the really stereotypical delivery. It's not flattering. You've got Mantan Moreland, who had an entirely, other career in films. My dad was a big fan of his, but he's got like the big, bugged out, bug eyes kind of thing. And, little Joe Jackson, the way that he's portrayed is the no good kind of carousing, like obnoxious heel. talk about miracles. Petunia Jackson must really love her husband, because I don't know how she stayed with him and prayed with him, prayed for him so hard through everything he put her through in this movie.
Well, also too interesting about Eddie Rochester Anderson. That's his full name. He goes by his character, popularized by Jack Benny. A very interesting background on his character, and he was the most popular person on the Benny program, besides Jack Benny, I guess. But besides, he had a crew of regulars on his show, but it was Rochester that everybody loved. Now we don't know if they loved him because of his portrayal of the black man that they thought the black man was, or that he was just a great comedic person. And if you listen to the old Benny shows or see the old Benny television show, Rochester is, I mean, Benny's a straight man for Rochester's antics, and Rochester's a very funny character. And again, reading the background, after World War II, Jack Benny was very affected by the Holocaust and the situation that came out of that. And he told his writers that we're taking every racial stereotype away out of Rochester's character from here on in, and also was a big human rights guy after that. So interesting story. And he played that character from 1937 to 1965. My gosh, I mean, crazy.
Wow.
And through, all the way into the mid civil rights era. 65 was, the apex of the civil rights era. It's crazy to play that kind of character that long and go through all that change. So,
well, it's also interesting because he and also one other cast member, at least one other cast member, I didn't look to see if anyone else was listed, but Butterfly McQueen, who plays Lily, both actors were in Gone with the Wind, I think, like 4 years.
So was Oscar
earlier.
Polk, and so was Ernest Whitman. I mean, yeah, they were people. They were working actors. They took their roles.
Yeah, I mean, Hattie McDaniel kind of gets the brunt of the attention for Gone with the Wind, because a lot of that movie, as much as it is, about slavery, it's about kind of everything else surrounding that culturally in the South of that time.
Right.
But yeah, it's got to be, it's interesting to see these characters going from portraying that kind of the slave servant role 4 years earlier to being again in Cabin in the Sky, where there's almost completely separated that from that reality. Now, at least in terms of the way that the characters talk and portray their existence in the film, as I mentioned, it's almost a pocket reality where it's outside of every other influence.
Right. Almost like a parallel universe.
Mm-hmm.
But Oscar Polk, interestingly enough, I would say, besides Butterfly McQueen, had one of the most prominent roles in Gone with the Wind. He played the butler.
That's right.
Not the butler, the house butler at Tara. And he plays the deacon. He has a very small role at the beginning where him and the main preacher have a conversation. He said, well, you can't send the deacon. You have to you have to go yourself to get Eddie Anderson's character to the church.
Yeah, I mean, there's and I was trying to look this up. What is the person who played the head, I guess, archangel who's trying to save little Joe? I didn't catch his name.
He is Rex Ingram, and he is a veteran black actor who was literally plucked off the street when he was a young man and put in the Tarzan movies. So he played a lot of the.
Well, he played Lucius. He was the bad guy, right? I'm talking about the guy who was trying to save little Joe.
Oh, the preacher.
Yeah. He had like another name. Yeah.
Right. I can't. Yeah, I got the deacon, which was Oscar Polk, and his name was Polk in Gone with the Wind, by the way. Oh. I used to be a big I would say Gone with the Wind was one of the most influential books and films in my pop culture education as a young man. Embarrassingly so now, but again, it's just like your isolation is your isolation. And if you hook into something, because I was a big reader and film buff, if you hook into something based on your, your study, that was one of my big things. I just love that film for its pop culture influence, and later to realize how I first realized it reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and everything.
Hmm.
And how embarrassed he was to go see that film because of the way blacks were portrayed in it. And from then on, that's all I could see. So
I saw Gone with the Wind
everybody
for the,
goes,
well, I was gonna say, I saw Gone with the Wind for the first time 2 months ago,
oh,
at a
wow.
screening at the Pickwick Theater, because it was going to be the last movie they showed before they shut down, but they, under new ownership, so the theater is going to continue to go. It was the
Right,
first movie they
right.
showed, and they wanted it to be the last movie. So I went with my wife. Neither of us had seen it before, and we both loved it. Um, Partially because we had heard all the stories about what the movie was, and we
Mhm.
walked away thinking it's not really that. I mean, it's not the
Right.
it's definitely a film of its time. So you're going to have different portrayals, not so flattering portrayals of black people as we would,
No.
if we were to try and tackle that subject matter today. But in terms of the main characters, Scarlett and Rhett, this movie does not like its central characters. This is not a pro South, pro glory of slavery movie. It
Well,
chronicles the downfall of these people.
I would say it's a pro lost cause thing, meaning that there's not real punishment for the main reason that they were fighting the war, which was the North wanted to free the slaves.
I, you know, I
Again,
that's a whole other conversation. I did a
right?
podcast on it
I
with,
know,
um,
but I'm
but
just saying that that's one of the reasons that I'm not as conducive toward it that I was when I was a younger guy. So it's again, it's complicated, and it's based on the fact that I've probably seen the film over 10 times. And it's just my journey with it. And your journey was you saw it 2 months ago for the first time. So
yeah,
it's a different kind of thing,
totally.
for sure.
Um, but yeah, it was just interesting to see those kind of those portrayal parallels in uh Cabin in the Sky.
Yeah.
And it's also
I
strange to
mean,
see a movie
it's
that came out four
definitely
years later
connected
be
to
in
Gone
black
with
and
the
white. Yeah,
Wind.
yeah. Um,
Um, Go ahead.
I was going to say it's a black and white film that came out after the brilliant color of Gone with the Wind.
Right.
But one thing that I was struck by, and I didn't pick up on this the first time I watched it, was the film making. Like, there's some bona fide like special effects and really, I think
Right.
especially there's a harrowing fight at the end in the gambling
It's
hall
just
where
unbelievable.
literally Petunia, this is a spoiler, folks, but Petunia prays for divine intervention, and God comes. I think she says, God, please come strike down this place of sin or something like that. All of a sudden, a
Right.
freaking tornado shows up right outside the window. It is very Wizard of Oz, which was also
Well, they
1939.
use the same effect in The Wizard of Oz. It
It
was the
it
same
looked
tornado effect as The Wizard of Oz.
it looked exactly like it, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But you've got people fighting each other. You've got people running out the doors. Then you've got the main
Crazy.
characters. You've got Domino and um, Little Joe tussling with each other. And then there's gunplay. Petunia gets shot. Joe gets shot. Lena
It's
Horne, which we
crazy.
mentioned in passing, her character Georgia Brown is stumbling through this wreckage, is literally like hunks of
It's the
building
whole
are
thing is
falling all around
collapsing.
her. Yeah, it's tense. I had forgotten the
It's
outcome of
it
this scene. I'm like, did everybody die in this? What happened?
it was amazingly realistic to me, which stunned me. I was like, well, here's this not light, but this musical, mostly musical numbers. Then suddenly we have this disaster sequence. I was like, that's crazy.
Right. I mean, it's the when the gun comes out, you're expecting, okay, because they had established that it's, Little Joe has 6 months to turn his life around. And they establish that, oh, it's 6 months. Tonight's the night. You know, his time's up. You figure the gun comes out, he's going to die and have to deal with the consequences. But Petunia goes first. And then when Joe goes up to see, you know, to help her out or whatever, I think there was an accident. I think Domino like misfired the gun or something, or he swung wildly, and they both end up dying and going to that kind of limbo place.
And then we see getting crushed by the building.
Right.
They got crushed by the building.
But when they go up to limbo, you get this great shot of these literal stairs winding up and up and up to heaven. It's a great little matte shot. But
I mean, and it's, go ahead.
I was going to say there's characters when the angels and the demons appear, they're popping in and out of, you know, the scene, you know, all in camera effects, but they're very smooth. I mean, it looks like magic.
Yeah, it's really well done. It's really well done. I think it was like Minnelli, his first directorial effort after being on Broadway, was coming in and saying, well, how do I use this train set? Much like Orson Welles came in with Kane and said, how do I use these effects to tell my story? And, you know, it was really, really kind of epic when you think about it. I think anybody who would saw it in the era would have said, wow, you know, that's a crazy way to end this film. And then, like you said, the descent into wherever they're going, I assume heaven, is so mystical. And in fact, you were talking about the black and white aspect of it. Just before they released the film, they decided it would look better in sepia tone. So that's how it was originally released. It was only when they released it on DVD that they didn't play up that sepia tone. Think of The Wizard of Oz again, in the black and white sequences was actually in sepia tone.
Right. Well, two things. One, watching this, there's a different effect, I imagine, watching it on my laptop at 4 o'clock in the morning, as I did today. Then
I watched
catching
it today too.
Right. But I would love to see this in a movie theater. You know,
yes.
I don't know if it's a tough question. Let me pose this to you. Is this the kind of thing that would be re-released today, even in like an art house revival theater? Do you think it would be considered problematic somehow?
Well, I would think it would be something that would be re-released as a discussable movie. I think you could definitely have a nice panel of maybe critics and African-American arts people talking about it afterward, because it's significant. I think, yes, it would be revived. I think it even could be revived without discussion, just on the fact that it's the first studio picture that had an all-black cast. It's not the first movie that had an all-black cast. There were race films, but this was the arts are always the progressive point, and MGM, being the biggest studio, was going to be the one that is going to make this musical and show the world that everybody's human. In fact, they had a policy in their commissary that blacks and whites could not eat together. And freaking Louis B. Mayer said, great, they'll come to my private dining room. And then the next day, everybody could eat at in the commissary. So yeah, there was definitely again, the Jewish people that created Hollywood and African Americans were always together in the sense of they were judged unfairly by the writ large society. So interesting. One of the things I wanted to bring up about the cast too, I wanted to look at the cast again, since it's Black History Month, as to their interaction with the civil rights movement that was only 10 years away or a dozen years away from the Montgomery bus boycott, which in essence began the movement. But also post-World War II, which was a huge thing because blacks came to the table and fought the war, and then were coming home to the same discriminatory practices. They weren't going to have any of it anymore. Right. And also another fact about Lena Horne, which blows my mind. she was asked to entertain the troops, but she didn't want to be in any audiences that were segregated. But of course, the army and the military itself were segregated. They would actually put the white German prisoners of war in the front row, and the African American soldiers who fought for this country in the rows afterward. So Lena Horne would start her show by moving through the audience and sing only to the black soldiers, and had her back to the German POWs. But it's just like, why would he even bring the POWs to the show? That's not. Anyway. So anyway, I looked at Ethel Waters was the most fascinating because I knew nothing about her before this movie, and she just had a incredible journey through her show business life, both of horrible prejudice and enlightenment. In fact, Elia Kazan, who directed her in Pinky, called her a combination of religiosity and free-flowing hatred. I mean, could you imagine such a description for a person? Wow.
Well, yes, because we do get a glimpse of her as a more, not necessarily as a person, but as a performer and a performance, because Petunia she's the most enjoyable one-note performance you could watch for the first 2/3 of this movie, because she's the saintly housewife who's praying for her husband. She really wants to, she doesn't know anything about this bargain with the devils and the angels. She just really wants to make sure, because she believes she's going to heaven when she dies. She wants nothing more than to spend eternity with her husband. But towards the end of the film, when the devil is sort of running out of plays, he conspires to have Little Joe win this Irish sweepstakes, which is going to net him $50,000 in 1943 dollars or whatever it is.
That's like almost $1 million now.
Right. So that is going to, for sure going to be the corrupting influence on a degenerate gambler, right? Plus, and it shows he gets the money thanks to Georgia Brown, she's a human being, but she is like the favored temptress, like Lucifer's preferred daughter, essentially. And Little Joe, essentially, he decides he wants to donate the money to church. That's his initial instinct is, oh, this is going to be great. I can really help people. And then he kind of embraces Georgia and says, look, I wouldn't have had this ticket if you hadn't brought it to me, because he didn't know how to read. She did. She presents it to him, right, as part of the temptation. But he says, I'm going to buy you a diamond bracelet and a fur coat, and then you're going to be set up just as a gesture. Right, but it's a gesture of friendship and gratitude. And of course, Petunia comes walking by at that inopportune moment, and she, chews out her husband. Some time passes. We go back to the gambling hall. Everyone's dressed in their finest. Little Joe is buying drinks for everyone, and he's blown most of his money. Petunia comes back in. It's the same night that Domino Joe has been released from prison for having shot Little Joe. And she just kind of turns to the dark side, quite a bit.
It's really wild.
Yeah,
really wild.
We get a taste of it early on when she's trying to out-con the con men with the dice game, which is kind of fun. That shows a bit of a savvy. But towards the end of this picture, we really get the sense of, she could be sort of a dangerous woman if she had not had those kind of religious aspirations.
Well, both sides of the coin are well played by her. She has a fascinating face. That's what really drew me to her, and a voice like heaven. Her singing voice is so unique, and again, not somebody that I knew of before. And in fact, it was interesting to me to understand, and I've been in the pop culture firmament for these many years. So here's the people I knew. I knew Eddie Rochester Anderson, of course, probably the best. But then second would be Louis Armstrong.
Oh yeah.
And then third would be Lena Horne. Then last would be Butterfly McQueen.
And Duke Ellington shows up in the to play in the big closing bar scene. Yeah.
But those four ranked would be the ones that I knew of the best. I know Duke Ellington, of course, and I'm glad you you mentioned him because he was not mentioned in the credits of the movie. But I actually saw Butterfly McQueen on stage in the 70s. It came back to me after watching the movie again. There was a touring company of Showboat, and she was prominent in the cast. And you know that distinct voice that I actually saw it live. It was crazy.
Wow.
And then I was reading her bio, and she just completely, at that point in time, had kind of given up on show business and was going back to school, and a very diverse person. But obviously she hooked into this. They offered her this part in Showboat Touring Company, and it came to Bloomington, Indiana. And that's where I saw her.
Wow.
Crazy. You think about it. But the reason I bring up the ranking of the people who I knew very little about Lena Horne and Butterfly McQueen. Nothing about Ethel Waters, who has done so many amazingly pioneering performances in Black entertainment history. I mean, but she was also a person with many, many demons, and was also a huge Jesus freak who followed Billy Graham around toward the end of her life. So very interesting context with her.
Well, it sounds like she was consistent, at least, as
Yeah.
far as the the religiosity, and I would
Yeah.
imagine this would be a good, that nice marriage of your beliefs and your passions and your work, being able to get that message across. Because yeah, it is a very religious and spiritual movie, but it's oddly not preachy. It's almost like just
No,
it's almost
no,
like
it
a
isn't.
sci-fi play of like angels and demons fighting over an immortal soul, but
Right.
it's also a charming musical. That the one song, and I can't remember the name of it. It was basically the song about Little Joe that was nominated for an Academy Award that
Yeah.
when this came out. Yeah.
Yeah. That was one of the things about Waters too, because of her religiosity. I think she was able to play both sides of the coin very well, going back to Elia Kazan's statement, but also the when she goes to the dark side at the end and suddenly is this kind of vampy character trying to show up Joe. She did that well too. So I
Yeah.
think she can plug into both sides of that because of her experience in life. And I was fairly impressed with Rochester too, because obviously I only know him as Rochester. He did several other movies around, but pretty much staying within the context of that character. Interestingly enough, not in the movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. He was not really playing the Rochester character, but just one of the frantic characters looking for the treasure in that movie, which again is just like the depth and breadth of these people as they moved along that path of the 20th century is extraordinary. I mean, Lena Horne was at the March of Washington. Louis Armstrong funded a lot of the civil rights movement. He worked behind the scenes, writing checks when they needed it, And did you see the Apple TV Plus documentary about Louis Armstrong?
No, I didn't. Is it new, or
Uh,
is it?
yeah, it's new. It's Louis Armstrong's Black and Blues, and basically because he was in the Black community, he was looked at as sort of an Uncle Tom character because he did that happy act, and they always looked at it as, well, he's placating the white audience so he could be, but he was a hell of a lot more than that. And Ozzie Davis tells a great story in the documentary about when he was working with him. He saw him in the corner just relaxing and taking off the Louis Armstrong persona and just relaxing as a man. And Davis said, I saw that in all my relatives, the burdens of life completely on their shoulders. And he said, then you went up to Satchmo and he became that character again, But he said that glimpse into his soul where he had the burden of that unique thing that African-American men had to go through in the mid 20th century.
Well, it reminds me of a
Fascinating stuff.
discussion It reminds me of a discussion we had a few years ago when that
Mm-hmm.
Sammy Davis Jr. documentary came out.
Yes.
This
Yeah.
is something that happened probably 20 years ish, after this happened. But you've got, Sammy Davis Jr. is the black guy in the Brat Pack, or the Rat Pack, not the
Right.
Brat Pack. That would have been very interesting. But
Yeah.
the sort of the man out of time when his music sort of went out of the Sinatra music went out of fashion, to civil rights
Right.
concerns, to just who is he in his life. Uh,
Right.
yeah, I mean, I gotta check out that documentary. Apple TV Plus, you say?
That, yeah. Louis Armstrong's Black and Blues. And I recently watched a Sammy doc again.
Hmm.
And one of the things that struck me was that here's a connection to Cabin in the Sky. There was a documentary, a short in the 30s where Sammy was a kid dancer called Rufus Jr. for President. Who's his co-star? Ethel Waters. I was like, I'm like, what? So I'm going to look more into Ethel Waters' life. I'm totally fascinated with her now. Uh, and she also had fascination with the show business historians. There's a lot of books on her. There was a one-woman show about her. So there's a lot of interesting um, persona to dig into with her that I found fascinating.
I might have to add that to my pile. Find a good biography. Um, but yeah, any kind of closing thoughts on Cabin in the Sky?
Well, again, I think one of the most remarkable elements of it, number one, it was the first studio picture that had an all black cast in response to how the world was changing, number one. And number two, catering to a large black audience who only had the race films and only had specific theaters they could go to. This was an idea of progress. This is in my point of view, from looking at it historically. And number two, the cast and the way that cast had to permeate the rest of the 20th century. One thing I will say, one of the most fascinating numbers to me, which has become a standard, was the it was the love song in the movie. I can't. But anyway, the guy doing the dance along with the song was Bill Bailey, and he was the brother of Pearl Bailey, a very distinctive and black entertainer of the 20th century. Taking a Chance on Love, that was the name of it. Phew, my memory. And then he does a bit in the dance called the backslide. It was the first moonwalk ever put to any kind of film. And he invented the step. So, God, it's just like it just that was the second thing about the film, that every aspect of these entertainers in this film influenced the 20th century entertainment going forward. And they had to go through their own journeys too, adding the civil rights movement into it. So those are my two big observations.
Well, the moonwalk thing is fascinating because, of course, we associate the moonwalk with, Michael Jackson. You had the Jackson 5
Right.
before he became Michael Jackson, and he was a huge bridge in, sort of mainstreaming black culture, black music, to the point where, I mean, you go to Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing, that whole bit
Right.
about Mookie and was it Pino, I think, talking about how the Italian guy, all of his favorite performers are black, but he won't, he
Right.
doesn't have any African Americans up on the wall of his family's establishment, and that kind of like weird hypocrisy.
Right.
Yeah, there's so much to think about here, just in the context of this movie. I
Right.
think because of what it was and when it was made.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so significant as we end Black History Month, because entertainment and athletics were the entree for Black Americans in the 20th century as they started to break down barriers. And to see the ultimate black movie in 1943 with the lineup of the best of the best, I would say, was in that movie. Singing, dancing, all that stuff. Comedy with Rochester, is to see something of historical significance, even as somebody who observes from the outside. I can't empathize with what was going on then. That's the thing. We can say, well, it was something for the period. That's how everybody was back then. But unless you live in that era, you really can't know. You can only observe from the outside.
Yeah. But we fortunately we're not living in that era anymore.
Yes.
We still have a long way to go in many regards, but looking back on these gems that I don't think have quite the awareness that they should. I mean, that's why I said, could this movie be shown in theaters now? My original point in bringing that up is I watched this on a laptop this morning. I really just wish that I could have experienced this, because I feel like musicals need to be experienced on a big screen with an audience who's totally like tuned in and turned on to what's going on. It definitely loses something when you're watching it at home. Like there's that one scene where Petunia and Joe are sitting like under a tree, and they're kind of like talking and singing to each other. And as the camera pans out, it's like this entire community of people are surrounding them, and you realize that they're at the edge of a river. And it very much gave me kind of I think it's probably because I watched Jesus Revolution recently, and there's a whole big like baptism motif in there. I was thinking this very much is like the community of people coming together to save little Joe's soul, right by the water. He doesn't get baptized, but there was sort of that energy to it, and I felt like that was something that I would like to see with an audience, because it's sort of a surprise, reveal, what's going on, the wider scene there. I feel like that would have been a cool like gasp moment, maybe even a cheer.
Well, it also goes back to your point about, there's religion in it, but it's not in your face religion. It's more of a subtle spiritual element, and that shot, as I remember it too, was very much in that key. And Arthur Freed, of course, the producer of all the great MGM musicals, to bring Minnelli in and to make it I would say a more personal type of musical rather than a spectacular kind of musical is part of his genius, I think. I think this is a genius film as far as its presentation, its significance in American showbiz history, and of course, that fine cast.
Well, and it's also fitting that we're beginning the year with Vincent Minnelli, and from what I understand, we're going to end the year with him too when we talk about Meet Me in St. Louis, which is the film that he met. I think that's where he met Judy Garland, who would,
he did.
Pairing would give us Liza Minnelli, so everything is related. So that'll be exciting.
It is. It'll be an interesting journey come 2023.
Well, speaking of interesting journeys, next month is going to be completely different. I almost guarantee it. When we talk about Flashdance from 1983.
I can't wait for that. I have not seen this since it came out, these 40 years ago. So, and I was I won't give anything away. That'll be for next month.
The only two things I know about Flashdance are Irene Cara's "What a Feeling," which I love that song. It's one of my anthems.
It's a great song.
Also the Bill Hicks joke when he's talking about Basic Instinct, and he said, "From the writer of Flashdance." It's like somebody wrote Flashdance. So we'll see. But Pat McDonald of HollywoodChicago.com. Thanks so much. It's always fun. I can't wait to talk to you about more stuff next month.
Brilliant.
All right, man. Take it easy and be well, sir.